Do you suffer with a fear of needles or syringes? Well, we'd like to share with you today the most common causes of that fear.
So there's 4 ways that you can create a fear or a phobia because no one's born with any phobias. So the first most common cause of a phobia is because of a traumatic experience or something that's happened to you. Now, if that's the case and you have had a traumatic experience, be sure to take a look on our YouTube film with tips to help. However, what you've got to realise is that no matter what your trauma was, the likelihood of an injection or needle being to blame and having orchestrated that issue is highly unlikely. It's usually the person that administered it and not the needle itself.
The second common cause is copying behaviour. Quite often, this is going to the doctor's surgery to see with your older sibling, and it can be, your sister, your brother, and they're having a vaccination, and you witness that vaccination. You then witness them crying, and therefore you create a reference that a needle, a syringe will make me cry. And ultimately, like to consider that actually it was your brother or sister who made you feel that way, not the needle.
Yeah.
So just please consider that. But also, it could have been that you have had a parent who was frightened of needles or syringes, and therefore you had the vaccination, and then you looked at your parents to see how to react. In the same way that when you're a child and you fell over, and you looked at them, if they just pick you up and said, oh, come on, let's go and see something else, you would never cry. However, if they go, oh, are you all right, and they rush to your aid, then you will start crying because you take the lead from your parents.
Yeah.
So if your parent had an issue with syringes or needles, then potentially that's where it came from.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the question is, was it even yours? A third way of actually getting a phobia is being told. And what we mean by that is that you don't even remember anything. You don't even remember a bad experience, but your parent has always told you that you have that fear. Now, that usually happens if, for example, you go for an injection. You could be crying about something completely different. It could be that in the waiting room, another child took a toy that you wanted to play with, and so you're crying, and your parent, because you're going for an injection, assumes that your upset and distress is about needles, and so they tell you. Just like how do you know what your name is because your parents told you. So you could have your fear of needles simply because you've been told. And if that's the case, then it's now time for you to make your decision.
And the last way is transference. Essentially, you've got a fear of syringes or needles because of another fear. And that, for example, that can be emetophobia. We actually have a full video on emetophobia on our channel. But emetophobia is a fear of vomiting. So a lot of people won't have injections or vaccinations in case a side effect from that is vomiting later on, or actually going into a doctor's surgery for an injection or a vaccination, because going in a doctor's surgery means being around ill people, means that I might catch something, means that I might vomit. So that's one thing. The other consideration is if you suffer with health anxiety, because again, if you have the vaccination, you might suffer some side effects, or actually going to get the vaccination, you're in a situation where you might catch something.
Yeah, agoraphobia is another problem because you're frightened of leaving the house, so you're already anxious. You go and have an injection, you go to the doctors, you assume that you're feeling anxious because you're having the injection, but it's because you've got agoraphobia, but you transfer those negative feelings, those anxious feelings onto that syringe. Another example could be masclophobia. So you may have origin of a fear of masks. And it might not even bother you because you might not come across masks very often, but you're in a medical situation, and because someone's got a mask on, you then start to have a phobic response. Again, because you're having an injection, you can transfer to the needle and start to feel panicky about having an injection.
Two other possibilities: dentophobia, if you've got a fear of the dentist, then because you know that going to the dentist usually starts with having a numbing injection, then that is now a fear of injections and syringes. And also germophobia, being frightened of germs. Having a vaccination, essentially you are getting germs to some degree, so your body can create the immunity. So again, that could be part of the fear.
Yeah, another two things could be fear of blood. So something, again, from childhood, and you then think, I'm going to have an injection, that might mean blood, and then you start to panic, again, usually sort of stemming back from childhood, or even fainting. The amount of people that we've come across who have created a phobia of fainting because they fainted when they had an injection, or they heard and then they heard that somebody fainted when having an injection. Suddenly, you put those together. So the origin is kind of the foundation, and that origin could be any of the things that we've just mentioned there. They were actually nothing to do with the syringe, but because you had a similar feeling, or it was in a similar scenario when you had the injection done, you've built that on top. The best way to address any phobia is to get that bottom level, move that foundation away and deal with it. And we do have a film specific about needle phobias with lots and lots of tips here on our channel.
But also, before we finish, I'd just like to consider, here's a syringe. I've had this on my knee or in my hand throughout this video, and guess what? Nothing's happened. And it won't do, because this is nothing but an inanimate object. And therefore, how can you blame this for anything? Because this isn't going to do anything. It only does something when somebody then decides to administer something. And therefore, just consider, it wasn't the needle that ever did anything to you, or that you copied, or one of your siblings. What it is, it's the person who administered it.
Yeah.
And just like anything in life, there are people who are good and bad at the jobs.
Yeah.
If you went to a hairdresser and they messed your hair up, you potentially would not go back. You'd find another hairdresser, right? And sometimes giving an injection, someone might have given you it in a bad way.
Yeah.
Or not explained it properly and it felt worse. So don't blame this.
Yeah, don't blame that, and don't forget that when you're little, we have a kind of a distorted view of reality, and we exaggerate things, which is great, because children, they're encouraged to use their imagination, but that can actually hinder when you've created a phobia, and that's something that we'd like to consider. If you want more information, you want us to, a more in-depth explanation of our therapy and how, if you were sat in front of us, how we would help you, our process, our therapy, our 5-step formula, then do take a look at our book, Conquering Anxiety, where we share our therapy, and it's based on as though you were sat in front of us, so that you can
it's
actually
like having a
experience
one-to-one
the journey.
session with us, basically.
Yeah.
But it's all about putting things into perspective. And the last thing I'd just like to consider is that you make things a lot bigger and a lot worse than they are, and that's how fears start. They're all based on essentially a story, and that story is, this is going to be a big needle and it's going to hurt. Just look at that. I bet you can't even see that on camera. It is so small you would not feel it.